Hi everybody, welcome back on this third and last day of our this symposium. So I'll be the chair for this panel on the artist book today, and same as we did for the last 3 days, I'll just present the two speakers and then we'll have the questions at the end of the presentations. So our first speaker is Viola Hildebrand-Schat. She is professor at the Institute of Art History at the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. Her teaching and research focuses on contemporary art, especially the text-image relationship in the artist's book. And her current research project on myth as narrative in contemporary Russian art, she investigates the question of experiencing reality, shifting reality, and the fictionalization of experienced reality. Her publications include those on artist books, such as Kunst verbucht and Die Kunst schlägt zu Buch, as well as a recently published investigation on the open archive Kartographie einer Reise by Sigrid Sigurdsson. And today, her presentation is entitled The Artist's Book as Paper Medium.
First, I want to thank the organizers of the conference for the invitation and for the possibility to speak here. The title of my presentation might be confusing because we all know that books are mostly produced with paper or with paper equivalent material, such as parchment or fiber of papyrus or other plants. My initial idea was to point out the multiple possibilities of how paper is used in the book production, mainly in that of the artist's books. Far beyond of being only a surface for print, paper in book can be cut, folded, bowed, and even sculptured. Especially by the treatment of paper, it became clear that the book is not only a pile of flat sheets, but forms a space of its own. As such, the book is close to an architectural construction closer to an architectural construction than to a means of print. Already minimal treatment of the paper, for example, slicing the page, pursing the surface, make it permeable, and opens the space of the book. Alike, permeability results from translucid or transparent paper, from cutouts, or even from picture alluding to transpersing the surface. However, the argument of my presentation will be the diversity of paper used in the Russian artist's book. I argue that the use of paper in avant-garde books reflects the economic situation of the time. Alike, artists refer to comparatively simple techniques such as wood or linoleum cut or lithography. These techniques were mostly available in art schools that didn't afford luxury material or special printing stuff. Shortage caused by general economic difficulties after the Russian Revolution inspired an aesthetic that still is of impact for the conception of contemporary artist books. In 1913, Wassily Kaminsky and Andrei Krasov published books printed on wallpaper. Surely, the use of the unusual material was part of the futuristic concept to break with rules and provoke. Kaminsky coined the term ferroconcrete poems, which he published under titles like Tango Viscose. We have seen an example of this book yesterday in the presentation of Stephen Bury, or Necked Among Dressed, which I show you the example of, which is less famous than the Tango Viscose. The text only roughly observed grammatical rules. Moreover, they directed to imagination by the rhythm and sound. Alike, the design should offer new ways of combination, and with this respect, the choice of wallpaper must be taken into account. Also, the artists involved in the production of the books reported about difficulties with the print machine. Due to the rest of wall on the paper, plaster, or glue, they couldn't print properly. The effects of these obstacles, however, had no impact on the result. Starting with examples for avant-garde, I want to demonstrate how the political and economic situation is reflected in the paper used for the books to become later a means of expression of its own. You see here some examples of futurist books or of books from the avant-garde, and you see already by the cover that the paper seems to be cheap and quite of low quality. The aesthetics born of a lack of materials became a program in later decades. Not only during the Stalinistic regime, but also in the present, artists deliberately resort to papers that show traces of use. The tragic choice of material, as well as the approaches already invoked in the avant-garde, have an impact on the future conception of the artist book in Russia. Thus, in addition to the various approaches, the use of papers, the presentation focus on how the avant-garde affects the present and its understanding of the artist book in the contemporary Russian context. However, the development in the use of paper for books was not linear consequent, was not consequent. Even after the experimental approaches of the Russian avant-gardists were increasingly rejected by the requirement of the new socialist system, the artistic use of the book did not come to an end. On the contrary, the book became one of the principal means for propaganda purpose. Namely, the innovative design and typography were used to underline the progression of the young Soviet state. Together with photography of high quality, it was applied to the propaganda album, books which to a great part were designated for distribution in Western countries. With the same purpose, magazines were carefully designed and printed in large numbers, further brochures for trade fairs presentation. They all were designated to raise the image of the Soviet Union abroad. High-quality design and illustration were also observed in children's books. Already at a young age, the Soviet citizen should learn what it meant to live in the Soviet Union. Beyond the book's official distribution by state publishing houses existed those from the Samizdat. Even if the Samizdat primarily served the distribution of text, artists also participated. They not only acted as creators, but also used the medium for their own concerns. Those publications were disseminated through non-conformist writers, artists, and their friends. Since the artists' Samizdat publication existed only in small numbers, often starting with a single copy, they often were presented in lectures in private apartments or studios. For reasons of presentation as well as for production, for transcribing, these publications sometimes were not bound, especially those from the artist Samizdat existed in single sheets to show them around. Even if the reasons and situation of publication changed from the avant-garde period in the Soviet to the Soviet time, the book survived as a paper medium and a media of communication and information. Finally, it emancipated itself as a genre of its own, the contemporary artist's book. Also, the contemporary Russian artist's book referred to the avant-garde books. The purpose of its concepts and production have changed completely. After the avant-garde, from the 20 years of the 20th century, the further group relevant to the artistic production of books were poets and artists who joined from the late 1950s to the mid-1960s in Lianosovo, a small industrial suburb in the north of Moscow. They met at the house of Oskar Rabin and his wife Valentina Kropivnitskaya. Initially, the circle consisted in family and relatives like Yevgeny and Lev Kropivnitsky. By and by, they were joined by friends, including the poet Genrikh Sapkir, Igor Kholin, Alexander Ginsburg, and Vyacheslav Nekrasov, as well as the artists Lydia Masterkova and Vladimir Nemuchin. They exchanged ideas and discussed works which deviated from the official guideline and consequently could not be shown in public. The text read at the meeting, mostly poems, found their way into self-made books. As basis served simple notebooks or exercise books. Then they were bound in painted covers or decorated with drawings. Also not explicitly designated as artist book, retrospectively they were received as artistic works. For the artists and the poets in Lianosova, they fulfilled the function as a media of communication. In every respect, these booklets formed part of the artistic samizdat. Sometimes the independent publishing was underlined by a corresponding note, as in the case of Nikolai Glaskov, who inserted on the title page of his edition the remark "Sam sebia istat," which meaning I published this myself. And since he placed the remark exactly at the point which normally in book publication is reserved for the publisher's name, Glaskov emphasized his self-perception of not being only an author, but alike taking over the function of the publisher. Other publications from samizdat served for documentation. They could consist only of typed pages, often duplicated with carbon paper, or also contained pictures, mainly photographs. The documentation on the destruction of churches in Moscow and the the documentation on the destruction of churches in Moscow and the surrounding is an example. The book contained black and white photographs of the destroyed buildings and handwritten entries indicating the places and the times of the destruction. Alike, Yevgenia Ginsburg's memories of the camp written down by hand and entitled as March of Life contained photographs, while those of Kirill Uspiensky, summarized in his diary from the imprisonment on remand in Leningrad, are illustrated with the author's drawings. I think I have to go back. Yes, these are. Uspiensky does not place images and text in a continuous narrative space, but seeks to make the best possible use of the paper. He continually changes the direction and turns the booklet when he needs a landscape format instead of a portrait format. None of the book intends to be explicitly artistic, yet by its composition, the integration of photographs and drawings, they show an aesthetic which revives in contemporary artist books. Since they are all make equal use of paper that are available in everyday life or reused paper that have already been used, the various publications are united by one aesthetic. Another point of reference for the contemporary Russian artist book is the experimental design in the avant-garde. It becomes obvious in the books from the 1960s and 1970s, referencing principles from the futurists. Examples are magazines like Nomer or Transponanz, both conceived and produced in very small editions by the couple Rini Konova and Sergei Sigei. They initiated their magazines in the mid-1960s with the purpose to establish a non-objective literature and a non-objective abstract art. They combined own text as well as those of friends with a non-conformist aesthetic. The proceeding was elaborated, often including material atypical for book production, for example, fabric, metallic or plastic foils, and all sorts of paper. Especially some elements in the design of Transponanz make clear that the artist disposed of contacts with the representatives of the avant-garde outside from Russia. At that time, it was impossible for the artists or for persons to get information of the avant-garde production. And what was received was information by publication the artists got from foreigners. With a cut from the side in the shape of a wedge, the issue of Transponanz distinguished from all other publication. However, the conception and publication of the magazine was only one part of the artist's production. Possibly, the wedge-shaped incision was meant to be an allusion to Lisitsky's 1990 poster, Beat the Whites with a Red Wedge. I don't know if I haven't. Lisitsky's red wedge was meant to signal the victory of the Russian Revolution. In the reception of Ikonova and Sergei, the meaning is changed, since the wedge forms a negative shape in transponence and at the same time runs counter to another triangle shape. It points to the failure of the revolutionary idea. Seen in this light, the form can be read as a statement by the artist on the current situation. The intellectuals, in particular, since long had seen through the socialist propaganda and openly spoke of a failed utopia. Hardly any of these paperworks were created specifically as artist books, according to Western understanding. Rather, the decision of the use of paper, book form and book format answered the endeavor to communicate the artist's idea in a manner that is practicable, that is as practicable as it's unobtrusive. Unlike a comparatively bulky painting or a heavy object, the book can pass unseen from hand to hand. Also, the production of books was for many artists familiar, especially for those who had a job at publishing houses or were employed with book illustration. It was precisely the manageability of book as well as that of works on paper that asserted that the form continued and inspired artistic practice. In 1984, a convolute emerged consisting of handwritten papers plastered with black and white photographs. Sorry, I have to go. While these provided the back shows typed text, while these provided the text on the back, the impetus for the title Unfinished Dissertation, the work itself consists of the photographs and commentary by the Charkov-born artist and photographer Boris Mikhailov. With its black and white photographs and handwritten comments in the margins, Mikhailov's work is a reminiscent of the Samizdat publication documentation on the destruction of the churches in Moscow and surroundings. Mikhailov also refers to his immediate present. The handwritten text contained his own observation or reproduced quotation from radio reports. The photographs are only loosely related to the text. They reflect the artist's occupation as a photographer outside the official canon. Photographs of unclothed people were considered pornography in the Soviet Union. And also Mikhailov had never shown pictures of this kind in public. His license as a photographer had been revoked when photographs the artist had taken of his nude wife were found in his studio. The situation changed fundamentally with perestroika. Non-objective art, which in the Soviet Union until then had been condemned as formalist, could now be practiced and shown freely. Even though artists continued to use paper of low quality and new material aspects came to light. Artists more and more used paper of high quality. The new type of artist book is primarily associated with the name of Mikhail Karasik. He referred to futurist conception at the time he incorporated his own production, the historical context. With this purpose, he used documents from the avant-garde, for example, posters, postcards, and drafts. With RMFAB, Karasik founded a publishing house designated to edit his own works as well as that of fellow artists. Was RMFAB one of the first publishers of contemporary artists' books? Soon after followed. Leonid Tishkov founded Dablus, Nikolai Kononov, INA, and other artists run publishing houses were Supremus and Mitki. Even if the history of the artist book can be traced back to the avant-garde and continued in the non-conformist scene of Samizdat, the current production of artist book only two parts can be grounded in this heterogeneous development. Certainly, contemporary artists noticed the development. Some of them refer to it, also not always with explicit references. Thus, parallels to Uspiensky's diary can be drawn on a formal level in the drawn stories of Leonid Tishkov At the same time, it becomes apparent that the artist also refers to Western comics. However, the books from the past provided example of conception and design. The different sign systems, such as text on the one hand and image on the other hand, do not result in an additive juxtaposition. Rather, they offer new ways of perception. Letters are regarded as images and vice versa, images are read as text. Relevant for the new perception are surely developments in linguistic and semiotics. In 1970, Yuri Lotman published Struktura hudожественного текста, the structure of the artist's text, a collection of essays examining the various levels of expression in the text and its structure. That Lotman did not have the literary text alone in mind, also the examples he cited, concentrated on it, became clear from the title. Also, Lotman bases his investigation primarily on examples of fine art literature. The term artistic text is to be understood in a broader sense, since it serves structural semiotic researches for describing the particularities of artistic expression in general. To subsume image, writing, text, and artistic creation equally under sign may have been one of the impulses for artists to summarize the various forms of expression on paper in the medium of the book. According to the prehistory, the spectrum of books produced by artists after 1990 is broad. Artists referred to concepts from avant-garde, coming up with new interpretation. Especially, they became interested in authors like Velimir Hlyabnikov or Daniel Harms. In their books, they developed new utopia and, with regard to their own presence, entirely new fictive world. One might think, for example, of Kopiska, a community conceived by Piotr Pirevitschentsev, and coming up with special reflections on paper. The community invented by Pirevitschentsev, existed solely through its writing, mainly documents, laws, and prescription. They have been handed down to posterity in records of all kinds, collected in codices, leporellos, blocks, and scrolls. Pirevitschentsev pretended having them found. Thus, they form the stock of the artist's book. They show a broad variety of forms, however, all linked to paper and to the format of the book. Scrolls, as well as wooden plates, reminded ancient books. Some are partly bound, some consist in loose leaves, but all of them show traces of time, such as yellowed paper or faded writing. Pirevitschentsev consistently used old material, files from liquidation, leftover forms from companies or enterprise that no longer exist. When the paper does not look old by itself, the artist applies special treatment to let it look old. Alike, the boxes, cassettes, or rolls he produced to store the books and scrolls are trimmed to look old. At the same time, they are examples of the wide use of paper as a material for construction, because all these stuff made by Pirevitschentsev is based on papers. They are made by paper, also the boxes. The ciphered and coded information in the books of Kopiska looks like a peculiarity, an invention of the artist. However, considering that information is a factor of power and thereover used to be kept in secret during the Soviet period, it becomes a statement of the books of Pirevitschentsev. Thus, the stories told by his books can be regarded as an allusion to practices in the Soviet Union. Pirevitschentsev is not the only one who defines his paperworks as relicts of world of their own in order to unravel thought, them a fictional parallel to the given reality, the boundaries of which are dissolved by artistic action. I come to my last example with Sergei Yakunin. Sergei Yakunin's works also form a world of its own that is revealed in the book. Even if Jakunin's books show similarity to those of Pierre Rechensev, Jakunin strives to extend the language of sign and to extend it to the material and the handling. He includes apparatus and elements of movement that require an extending reading. Haptic qualities became significant, such as special papers, for example, crumbled Japanese paper, different types of wood, cords and small metal parts. In Jakunin's work, the poet Daniel Harms received a prominent place. Jakunin edits his books under the brand Harms Cabinet. Many of his books are based on stories by Harms. Also, the artist creates a special ambience for the poet. With reference to the peculiarity of Harms, as they were reported by the relatives and his contemporary, Jakunin builds special rooms solely with paper, centered on Harms' writings, activities, and dominated by a book and paper-related elements. One example is a Harms Cabinet, a cryptic construction full of allusion and secret messages. For its creation, Jakunin used cardboard, wood wire, and small objects from a scrap metal dealer, such as metal springs, spiral bells, and small bells, incorporated into his installation that trigger movements and sounds as soon as a corresponding mechanism is set in motion. The interior contains a winged horse. I hope I have. The interior contains a winged horse, Pegasus, as embodiment of genius, but above all, an unusual library. The latter refers more to Harms' inner creative world than to the actual world of the poet. In fact, during his whole life, Harms lived in a communal flat and never disposed about a space of his own. The extensive expansion of Jakunin's installation may be surprising, as it goes beyond the scope of what can be considered an artist's books. However, the work conceived as books are formally oriented towards the futuristic works that were current during Harms' lifetime. This is an example. The texts are written with pen. The style of the letters is reminiscent of the medieval script. The drawing, executed with a few strokes, are reminiscent of stone carvings. As such, they remind the aesthetics of avant-garde books of Goncharova and Khrushchev. Those neo-primitivistic works were designed with regard to relevant sources of pre-Christian and folk art. Other books are reminiscent of block books, only they were printed with linoleum plates instead of woodcut. Striking are also the bindings with their pronounced relief of the front and back, executed in a papier-mâché techniques peculiar for Jakunin. I'm going back again. Also, these covers are produced with paper. They have the appearance of heavy incunabla. Thank you for your attention.